It was an unusually warm spring afternoon in St. Mary Mead, a village so accustomed to its tranquility that even the rustling of the leaves seemed to hush in reverence. The village square, with its stone cottages and winding lanes, appeared untouched by the modern world. The small bell tower of the church chimed the hour, its echoes ringing out like a reminder of time's gentle march. The peacefulness of the afternoon was only interrupted by the occasional murmur of village gossip, which was as common as the birds in the trees. But that, too, was generally harmless. Chapter 01. Today, however, there was a slight deviation from the norm. The annual garden party at Mrs. Violet Darby's manor was underway, and the house was alive with activity. The estate was not large by grand country house standards, but it was well maintained, with a sprawling lawn and flowers in full bloom, creating an idyllic atmosphere for the gathering. Mrs. Darby, ever the perfect hostess, was doing her best to ensure that her guests were well catered for, circulating among them with practiced grace and charm. It was an event that brought together the village's most prominent figures, village elders, the local schoolmaster, the vicar, the shopkeepers, and a few outsiders who had made their homes here. Among the guests was Miss Jane Marple, a woman who, despite her unassuming appearance, soft, gray hair neatly tied back, a gentle smile, had a way of observing people that often went unnoticed. She was a regular at such events, though she preferred to remain in the background, content to sip her tea and listen. She was no stranger to the village gossip and the personal intrigues that unfolded at these gatherings, but she never made herself part of the drama. Instead, she observed, piecing together the complex puzzle of human nature in the way only someone with her quiet genius could do. It was just after tea, and the conversation had turned to the latest village news, that the first strange thing occurred. A woman whom no one seemed to recognize appeared at the gate of the manor. She was uninvited, and her presence immediately drew the attention of the guests. Her arrival was not marked by fanfare or notice. She simply walked into the garden, her eyes scanning the crowd before locking onto a few familiar faces. There was a sense of unease that rippled through the group as the woman approached Mrs. Darby, stood near the large fountain, chatting with a group of local ladies. Miss Marple, sitting under the shade of an old oak tree with her tea, watched this interaction unfold. She noticed the way Mrs. Darby stiffened as the woman approached, how her polite smile faltered for just a moment. The woman was dressed in a simple yet elegant gown, but her demeanor was anything but simple. There was something sharp about her, something that immediately set her apart from the rest of the guests. "Who was that?" Miss Marple asked the elderly woman seated next to her, her voice soft and casual. "Oh dear," the woman replied, squinting in the direction of the newcomer. "That's Miss Lillian Farnsworth. I thought she had moved to London years ago." "Okay, apparently. A little odd, if you ask me." Miss Marple's eyes narrowed as she watched the exchange between Miss Farnsworth and Mrs. Darby. It was clear that there was some history between the two women, but Miss Marple couldn't quite decipher it yet. Mrs. Darby's lips were pressed tightly together, and her eyes flickered to the side as Miss Farnsworth spoke. The smile that Mrs. Darby gave her was polite, but it lacked warmth. Miss Farnsworth was clearly not interested in small talk. Her conversation with Mrs. Darby seemed strained, and Miss Marple caught a glimpse of her sharp, assessing gaze as she looked over the gathered guests. For a moment, it seemed as if she was scanning each individual with an almost clinical detachment, noting their reactions. Then, as quickly as she had appeared, Miss Farnsworth excused herself and made her way toward the back of the garden, disappearing behind AHEDGEROW. The conversation among the guests picked up again, but Miss Marple couldn't shake the feeling that something was amiss. The way Miss Farnsworth had entered the scene so quietly, without any introduction or announcement, was unsettling. She had disrupted the easygoing atmosphere of the party in an instant, And the more Miss Marple thought about it, the more certain she became that Miss Farnsworth's arrival was not an accident. Quite a character, isn't she? The elderly woman next to Miss Marple muttered, clearly still distracted by the uninvited guest. Miss Marple smiled politely, but didn't respond. Instead, she set her teacup down and stood up, smoothing the folds of her dress as she made her way over to the gathering where Miss Farnsworth had just spoken with Mrs. Darby. There was something about the interaction that felt out of place, and Miss Marple wanted to know more. She approached the group of guests, now dispersed, but still deep in conversation. Mrs. Darby was nowhere to be found, but Miss Farnsworth's abrupt exit had left an awkward gap. Miss Marple drifted casually toward a pair of women talking near the fountain, careful to keep her movements unassuming. "I say, who is that woman?" one of them was saying, her voice low but conspiratorial. She certainly didn't act like she belonged here. And did you see how Mrs. Darby looked at her? It was like she had seen a ghost. Miss Marple's ears perked up. She could sense the thread of intrigue. It was the same kind of quiet gossip that she had heard many times before, the kind that revealed far more than the words themselves. She made her presence known just enough to catch the next part of the conversation. "I hear she had a bit of a falling out with Mrs. Darby years ago," the second woman added, her voice filled with the thrill of a scandal. "Some sort of disagreement. About money, I believe. There's always been talk about Lillian Farnsworth, but no one's ever quite sure what's true." Miss Marple's brow furrowed as she absorbed this new information. Seemed that Miss Farnsworth had a past here in St. Mary Mead, a past that was still very much alive in the minds of the villagers. A disagreement about money, a rift with Mrs. Darby. These were the things that lingered in the background of any small town. And Miss Marple had learned long ago to pay attention to these details. "Thank you," she said quietly, nodding to the two women before turning to leave the gathering. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but Miss Marple knew better than to jump to conclusions too quickly. There was a story behind Miss Farnsworth's return, and it was one that Miss Marple would uncover in her own time as the sun began to set and the garden party wound down. Miss Marple made her way back to her cottage, her mind already working through the tangled threads of the day's events. She would need to speak with Mrs. Darby, of course, but for now, she had more pressing matters to consider, specifically Miss Farnsworth's return to the village and the secrets she carried with her. It seemed that the mystery in St. Mary Mead was only just beginning. The morning after Miss Farnsworth's unexpected return, St. Mary Mead seemed eerily quiet. The usual hum of village life, the cheerful chatter in the market square, the rhythm of busy feet shuffling along cobbled streets was now filled with whispers. Everywhere Miss Marple went, she could feel the weight of hushed conversations, furtive glances exchanged behind hands and over garden fences. It was not unusual for people to gossip in St. Mary Mead. That was part of its charm, or so many of the villagers would have said. But the return of Miss Farnsworth had injected an unfamiliar tension into the atmosphere. For a village where everyone knew everyone's business, this uninvited reappearance was not only a curiosity, was a problem. There was a history, a murky past tied to Miss Farnsworth's name, and it was something the village preferred to forget. But memories, as Miss Marple knew, were like old newspapers. They could be buried, but never completely erased. Miss Marple had spent the morning going about her usual business. She stopped by the post office, exchanged pleasantries with the grocer, and had a quiet word with the vicar about his upcoming sermon. But everywhere she went, the topic of conversation was the same: Miss Farnsworth. By noon, she made her way to Mrs. Darby's house. As the matriarch of the village, Mrs. Darby was always at the center of things, whether she wanted to be or not. She had been the host of the garden party, and her association with Miss Farnsworth, it seemed, was something that still caused a stir. Miss Marple had observed Mrs. Darby's discomfort the day before, when Miss Farnsworth had shown up unannounced at the gate. The sharpness in Mrs. Darby's expression had not gone unnoticed by Miss Marple. There was a history there, a deep-seated tension that had only grown since Miss Farnsworth's sudden return. And it was that history, more than anything else, that intrigued Miss Marple. She arrived at the Darby estate just as Mrs. Darby was stepping out to tend to her prized rose garden. The elegant woman was tall, with sharp, defined features that spoke of years spent in social circles where appearances mattered far more than emotions. She gave Miss Marple a polite but strained smile when she saw her approaching. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you," Mrs. Darby said, her voice warm, but clearly masking something. "I trust you're keeping well." Miss Marple returned the smile with her usual gentle demeanor. "I am, thank you, Mrs. Darby. I was just passing by and thought I'd stop for a chat." "Hope you don't mind." "Not at all, Mrs. Darby," replied, her eyes flicking nervously toward the house, as though she were contemplating whether to invite Miss Marple inside or not. She seemed on edge, almost as if she were afraid of something. "It's a quiet day, as you can see. The garden always helps me unwind. You know, of course, that we had a visitor at the garden party yesterday." Miss Marple nodded carefully, observing Mrs. Darby's reaction. "Yes, Miss Farnsworth," she said, the name slipping from her lips without hesitation. "Quite an unexpected appearance, wasn't it?" At the mention of Miss Farnsworth, Mrs. Darby's composure cracked, ever so slightly. Her hand tightened around the shears she had been using to prune the roses, and for a fleeting moment, Miss Marple saw something flicker in her eyes, a flash of something that might have been fear, but quickly masked by a courteous smile. "Yes. Well, it was a surprise," Mrs. Darby said, her voice forced. "I had no idea she was coming. She said she wanted to revisit the old village and see some familiar faces, but I didn't expect her to come barging into the party like that. It was ... uncomfortable." "I imagine it would be," Miss Marple replied, her tone light but sharp. She leaned in slightly, as though offering a comforting word. "It must have been quite the shock after all these years." Mrs. Darby's face tightened again. "A shock, indeed. But one must always be gracious. Of course, it's simply what one does. No sense in causing a scene, is there?" She paused and looked away, her voice lowering. "I don't want to talk about it. It's in the past. Let's leave it there." But Miss Marple was not so easily dissuaded. "Of course, Mrs. Darby. But you must admit, it is curious, her sudden appearance. Don't you find it odd?" Mrs. Darby's fingers drummed softly on the arm of her chair, as though she were gathering her thoughts. Then she gave a short, sharp sigh. "I know what you're implying, Miss Marple," she said, her voice softer now, but edged with a hint of defensiveness. "And I'll tell you this much, Lillian Farnsworth and I had our differences, but they are behind us. Whatever happened back then, I've moved on. I've put it all in the past." Miss Marple gave a small, knowing smile, but she didn't press further. She could see that Mrs. Darby wasn't ready to speak about whatever had happened between her and Miss Farnsworth, and in truth, Miss Marple didn't need her to. She had already gathered enough to start her investigation. Mrs. Darby's discomfort, her reluctance to talk about the past, and her clear nervousness in the presence of Miss Farnsworth all pointed to something that still weighed heavily on her. "Well, I won't press you further, Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said lightly, standing to leave. "But it is strange, isn't it, that someone so ... influential would return after so many years. It's almost as though she's come back to finish something she started." Mrs. Darby looked up sharply, her eyes widening just for a moment before she regained her composure. "I don't know what you mean," she replied, though the nervousness in her voice betrayed her. Miss Marple smiled again, this time more knowingly. "I'm sure you don't, Mrs. Darby. I'm sure it's all a simple coincidence." As Miss Marple walked away from the estate, she felt the familiar stirrings of curiosity in her mind. There was far more to this story than Mrs. Darby or anyone else in the village was willing to admit. Farnsworth had come back for a reason, and Miss Marple knew that the story of their shared history would unfold in time. Mrs. Darby, for all her composure, was holding on to something important, and then there was the reaction of the other villagers. As Miss Marple made her way back through the village, she overheard fragments of conversation that further fueled her suspicions. People were talking about Miss Farnsworth, yes, but there was a tone of fear and confusion beneath the words. It was clear that her return had unsettled more than just Mrs. Darby. The villagers felt the weight of something unresolved, something that had remained buried for years. Later that evening, as Miss Marple sat in her cozy sitting room, reflecting on the day's conversations, a sudden realization struck her. Farnsworth wasn't just back to revisit the village. She had come back to finish something long forgotten, perhaps, but still very much alive. And Miss Marple, as always, was determined to find out what that was. The pieces were starting to fall into place, but they were only the beginning. Miss Marple knew that she had to continue looking, continue listening, for it was in the details, the smallest moments, that the truth would reveal itself. And though the village might believe that everything was over, Miss Marple knew better. This story was far from finished. Chapter 02. The following days in St. Mary Mead were anything but quiet. Miss Farnsworth's return continued to stir the village in ways that no one had expected, and Miss Marple's keen observations only deepened her sense of intrigue. The village swirled with gossip. Miss Farnsworth became an enigma in the middle of it all. While many had tried to dismiss her as an outsider, too many unanswered questions remained for Miss Marple to let the matter rest. Though it was now clear that Miss Farnsworth had returned with some purpose, the question lingered: what exactly was she trying to accomplish? And why had she chosen this moment, after so many years, to return to the village that she had so clearly left behind? There were whispers of old grievances, of connections long severed, but Miss Marple was not one to take idle gossip at face value. She needed to observe, to listen carefully, for that was the only way the truth could be uncovered. Miss Marple, ever the quiet observer, had already begun her own form of investigation. She had spoken to a few villagers and casually gathered what little information she could. She had always known that people, especially in small villages like St. Mary Mead, were not as careful with their words as they thought. Their casual conversations often held more weight than they realized. On a bright and crisp morning, Miss Marple made her way to the village market. The air was filled with the scent of fresh bread and blooming flowers, the chatter of the villagers blending into a familiar backdrop. As she perused the stalls, she overheard a conversation between two of the village's older women, who were huddled near the butcher's stall. They spoke in hushed tones, but Miss Marple caught every word. "Did you hear about Miss Farnsworth's return?" one woman asked, her voice laced with curiosity. "Of course," replied the other, her eyes darting around to make sure no one was listening. "I heard she came back to settle some old business. People are saying it's about money, ... Something to do with the Darbys, though no one really knows." Miss Marple paused, pretending to examine a basket of apples as the conversation continued. "Money, you say?" the first woman asked. "What kind of business would she have with Mrs. Darby? They don't even speak anymore." "Huh, but that's just it," the second woman whispered, leaning in closer. "It's not Mrs. Darby she's after. It's her late husband's estate. There were rumors of a will, a fortune hidden away, and, as you know, the Darbys have always been a little secretive." Interesting." The first woman glanced over at Miss Marple and lowered her voice. "Do you think Miss Farnsworth's return has anything to do with Margaret's death? People are already talking about it. Some say she's here for more than just the Darbys' money." The conversation died down as they noticed Miss Marple's attention. She smiled politely and moved on, but her thoughts were already racing. A will, a fortune, hidden away. And what did this have to do with Margaret's death? Margaret's death. The mention of Mrs. Darby's late husband and Miss Farnsworth's connection to him was a significant clue. Miss Marple's mind whirred with possibilities, and she could not shake the feeling that the Reverend and Miss Cutts had only been part of a larger story. There was much more, that was yet to be revealed. By the time she returned to her cottage, Miss Marple's mind was full of questions. The pieces were beginning to form, but they were still too scattered to make sense of. She had learned enough to know that Miss Farnsworth had come back to the village for a very specific reason, but that reason was still elusive. The conversation in the market had sparked an old mystery that might hold the key to understanding everything that had been happening. Later that afternoon, Miss Marple decided to visit Mrs. Darby. The woman's distress from the garden party had been evident. And Miss Marple believed that a quiet conversation might yield some answers. Mrs. Darby, though proud and composed, had always been a woman of hidden depths. Miss Marple knew that if anyone could shed light on Miss Farnsworth's return, it would be her. She arrived at Mrs. Darby's house as the sun began to set, casting long shadows across the well-maintained garden. The door to the manor was opened by a maid, who greeted Miss Marple with a polite but restrained smile. "Miss Marple, how lovely to see you." Mrs. Darby's voice called from the drawing room, where she was sitting by the window. "Do come in. It's been a while, hasn't it?" "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, stepping inside. "I thought I'd stop by for a chat, if you're not too busy, of course." Mrs. Darby motioned to the chair opposite her and poured a cup of tea for Miss Marple. She sat down, her posture perfect, though Miss Marple could sense the tension in her shoulders. There was something she was holding back, and Miss Marple's trained eye caught every detail. "What a lovely afternoon," Miss Marple began, her voice calm. "Though I dare say the village has been quite lively lately. Wouldn't you agree?" Mrs. Darby's eyes flickered, and for a brief moment she looked away, as if she were thinking of something she didn't wish to share. "Lively, indeed," she replied softly, her fingers resting on the edge of her teacup. "I suppose you're referring to Miss Farnsworth's return." Miss Marple smiled gently. "I suppose I am. I must admit, it was a bit of a surprise, to see her after all these years." Mrs. Darby stiffened slightly, and Miss Marple saw the briefest hint of discomfort cross her face. "I didn't expect it either," Mrs. Darby said, her voice slightly strained. "But one mustn't dwell on the past. Lillian and I, we had our disagreements long ago. I prefer not to revisit them." Miss Marple leaned forward slightly, her eyes steady on Mrs. Darby. "I understand, Mrs. Darby, but I must admit, I do wonder what exactly has brought Miss Farnsworth back to the village. After all these years, what would compel her to return now, especially with so many old wounds?" Mrs. Darby's hand trembled slightly, and she set the teacup down with a soft clink. "I really don't know," she said quickly, though Miss Marple could see the lie in her eyes. "I'm sure she has her reasons, but it's not my business, is it?" Miss Marple paused, watching her carefully. There was something Mrs. Darby wasn't saying, and it was beginning to irritate Miss Marple's normally patient demeanor. She knew better than to press too hard. She would allow Mrs. Darby to reveal what she could when she was ready. "Of course," Miss Marple replied, her tone gentle. "But you must understand, the village is in a state of unrest, I believe. You see, Miss Farnsworth's return coincides with some rather unsettling events, and I can't help but wonder if there's a connection." Mrs. Darby's face tightened at the mention of Miss Farnsworth's return and the rumors swirling around the village. For a moment, the two women simply sat in silence, the weight of unspoken truths hanging in the air. Finally, Mrs. Darby spoke, her voice barely a whisper. I can't say what Lillian is really after, Miss Marple, but I'll tell you this, she has a history in this village. And not all of it is as innocent as it seems. Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat. The village's history, the Darby's own past there, was something here, something Mrs. Darby was alluding to. What do you mean? Miss Marple asked softly. Mrs. Darby's gaze shifted toward the window, her fingers clenching the edge of her chair. I wish I could tell you everything, but there are some things that are better left buried. Miss Marple sat back, her mind spinning with the new piece of the puzzle she had just uncovered. Mrs. Darby knew more than she was letting on. And Miss Marple had the sense that the village's darkest secrets were finally beginning to surface. This mystery was far from over. The truth, as always, was hidden just beneath the surface, waiting to be revealed. And Miss Marple was more determined than ever to uncover it. The next few days saw Miss Marple returning to her quiet routines, but her mind remained sharp, turning over the events of the garden party and the conversations she had overheard. There was something strange about Miss Farnsworth's return to St. Mary Mead, and though much had been said, it seemed that few could piece together the whole story. As always, Miss Marple understood that the full truth was hidden in the smallest details, those fleeting moments that others, too eager to judge, missed. She had visited Mrs. Darby, of course, and the older woman's discomfort had only deepened Miss Marple's suspicions. While Mrs. Darby had been polite, there was an unmistakable shift in her demeanor at the mention of Miss Farnsworth. The talk of old grievances, of hidden estates, and long-forgotten disagreements didn't sit right with Miss Marple. She had heard the whispers of a hidden fortune, but there was more to it than that. It wasn't just about money. It was about power, about secrets, about something buried deep beneath the surface of St. Mary Mead. The constable, as always, was working hard to piece together the facts. However, Miss Marple could sense his unease. He had been quite thorough in his investigation, but there was a certain hesitancy in his actions. His questions, though earnest, seemed to be aiming at the wrong people. His focus narrow. It was evident that the constable, eager to close the case, was missing something critical: the emotional undercurrents that tied the villagers together, the long-held tensions that shaped their actions. And then there was Miss Farnsworth. The more Miss Marple thought about her, the more she believed that the woman had returned for more than just a simple visit. There was something about her quiet confidence that suggested a deeper plan, a reason for her sudden reappearance that no one had yet uncovered. Miss Farnsworth had been at the center of the scandal years ago, and the tension between her and Mrs. Darby spoke volumes. But what was the real story? What had Miss Farnsworth come back to settle? Miss Marple began her own investigation in earnest. She knew that sometimes, when people were intent on hiding the truth, the best way to learn more was not through direct questioning, but by observing their actions, listening to their words when they thought no one was paying attention. It was in those moments of unguardedness that Miss Marple could often find the key to unlocking the mystery. The first person Miss Marple turned to was the vicar, Wren Beecham. He was a man of considerable standing in the village, and Miss Marple had always found him to be a steady, if somewhat reserved, character. But there was something about him that seemed out of place lately. The stress of the garden party, the disruption caused by Miss Farnsworth's return, had taken a toll on him. His usual calm demeanor had been replaced by an air of distraction, as though he were carrying a burden he wasn't ready to share. Miss Marple visited him under the pretext of discussing the upcoming service. They sat together in his study, room filled with the scent of old books and polished wood, as the conversation drifted to the village's recent events. Miss Marple noticed how the Reverend's hands fidgeted with a small, worn book that lay open on his desk. He avoided her gaze, his words slow and measured, as though he were carefully choosing each one. "Reverend, you must be as surprised as everyone else by Miss Farnsworth's return," Miss Marple said, her tone casual, as though she were making a simple observation. The Reverend paused for a moment before responding, his fingers stilling on the book. "I suppose I am," he said slowly, his voice careful. "But one cannot be truly surprised by the unexpected in a place like this. People come and go, Miss Marple. The village has seen its share of comings and goings over the years." Miss Marple tilted her head, noting the slight unease in his voice. "Of course, but there's something about Miss Farnsworth's reappearance that feels different, don't you think? It's not every day that someone just walks back into our lives after so many years. The Reverend's eyes flickered briefly toward the window, his expression unreadable. "Perhaps, but the past is the past, and one should not dwell on it too long." Miss Marple studied him carefully. There was something in his response that didn't sit right. His dismissal of Miss Farnsworth's return, the way he deflected the conversation with such ease, it spoke of someone who was hiding something. Was the Reverend trying to distance himself from the past? Or was there more to his relationship with Miss Farnsworth than he was willing to admit? "Indeed," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft but steady. "But, as you know, the past has a way of catching up with us, don't you think, Reverend?" The Reverend cleared his throat, his discomfort now palpable. "I suppose we all carry our pasts with us, but one must learn to move forward." Miss Marple smiled faintly. "Yes, of course. And yet, the past always seems to have a way of resurfacing, doesn't it? One way or another." She could see the shift in his expression, the way his jaw tightened ever so slightly. He was hiding something. Miss Marple was certain of it, a key. But whether it was his own guilt or something tied to Miss Farnsworth was still unclear. As she left the Reverend's study, she made a mental note to revisit him later, when the pressure of the situation might bring out a different response later that day. Miss Marple overheard another snippet of conversation that piqued her interest. This time, it was between Miss Cutts and a few of the village women at the local bakery. Miss Cutts had always struck Miss Marple as someone with a bit of an agenda, a person who kept her cards close to her chest. She was a fixture in the village, well respected and well liked by many, but Miss Marple had always sensed there was more to her story than met the eye. "I tell you, Miss Cutts," one of the women said, her voice low and conspiratorial, "there's something about Miss Farnsworth's return that just doesn't sit right with me." After all these years, Miss Cutts' sharp gaze swept across the room before she spoke, her voice low but firm. "You're not the only one who feels that way, my dear. But there's nothing we can do about it, is there? Miss Farnsworth is here, and she's bound to make waves." Miss Marple, standing just outside the bakery, barely suppressed a smile. Miss Cutts' response had been quick, defensive even. There was something she was worried about, something she didn't want anyone to dig too deeply into. The conversation continued, but Miss Marple had heard enough. Miss Farnsworth's return was unsettling many people in the village, and Miss Cutts was no exception. Miss Marple's instincts told her that Miss Cutts, like the Reverend, was hiding something. The tension in her voice, the quickness with which she dismissed the conversation, it all spoke of a woman who was trying to bury something she feared might come back to haunt her. Miss Marple took another mental note. She would need to speak with Miss Cutts soon, but not just yet. The time would come when the pieces of the puzzle would fall into place, and the truth would be exposed. But for now, Miss Marple's quiet investigation had uncovered some interesting patterns. People were nervous, and their nervousness pointed toward secrets, old and new. It was only a matter of time before those secrets came to light. For now, though, Miss Marple remained patient. She would observe, she would listen, and when the time was right, she would uncover the hidden truths of St. Mary Mead. The story was far from over, and the first suspects were only just beginning to reveal themselves. Chapter 03. As the days wore on, Miss Marple found herself increasingly drawn into the quiet ebb and flow of the village's life. Despite the apparent calm, there was a constant undercurrent of tension. People went about their usual business, but it was as if a shadow had fallen over St. Mary Mead, one that would not lift until the village had faced its past, whether it wanted to or not. Miss Farnsworth's return had not only disrupted the villagers' case, but it also stirred up old emotions and half-remembered stories. Miss Marple, ever the observant one, noted how certain individuals had grown quieter, more secretive, while others had begun to open up more freely. The latter group, of course, was full of colorful gossip, but it was often the quiet, reflective ones who held the key to what had happened all those years ago. She kept track of each conversation, each hesitant admission, and each comment that, at first glance, seemed trivial, but held deeper meaning under closer scrutiny. It was on one such day, a brisk autumn afternoon, that Miss Marple decided to revisit the location that had played such an important role at the garden party, Mrs. Darby's manor. The house itself stood like a monument to propriety, its walls holding the secrets of the many events that had taken place there over the years. However, despite its outward serenity, Miss Marple had always believed that there was something lurking beneath the surface, something that Mrs. Darby was hiding, something tied to Miss Farnsworth's past. Miss Marple had heard enough to know that the relationship between Mrs. Darby and Miss Farnsworth had been fraught with tension. But it was not just their personal history that was important. It was the history of the village itself. St. Mary Mead was a small place, okay? And people's actions had a way of catching up with them, even if it took decades. She arrived at the manor just as the late afternoon sun cast long, golden shadows across the garden. The large estate, with its perfectly manicured lawns and rows of well-maintained hedges, seemed untouched by time. Miss Marple paused at the garden gate, observing the tranquility. But it was the sense of stillness that unsettled her. A place that seemed so perfect, so in order. Kay often hid the most significant truths. As Miss Marple walked toward the house, she couldn't help but notice the small, insignificant details that others might overlook: the slightly uneven bricks in the pathway, the faded flower pot near the door, the faint smell of something burning in the air. These small things often told Miss Marple more than the polished exterior ever could. They spoke of neglect, of things left unsaid, of cracks in the veneer of perfection. She was greeted by the housemaid, who ushered her inside with a polite smile. Miss Marple was well known enough in the village that Mrs. Darby would expect her, though the woman's cool reception had not gone unnoticed. "Ah, Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby said, rising from her armchair by the fire. "It's lovely to see you. How kind of you to visit. Would you care for some tea?" Miss Marple smiled politely, sitting down in the seat opposite Mrs. Darby, who had returned to her quiet, contemplative posture. The fire crackled softly in the hearth, and Miss Marple felt the warmth of it seep into her bones. But the tension between the two women was palpable. Miss Marple wasn't sure if Mrs. Darby was merely put off by the interruption, or if it was the conversation they were about to have that made her uneasy. "I've been thinking, Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple began softly, her voice gentle but carrying an undertone of insistence, "about Miss Farnsworth's return. You must be quite surprised to see her after so many years." Mrs. Darby's hands trembled ever so slightly as she set her teacup down. The movement was subtle, but Miss Marple noticed it immediately. "I admit, I was surprised," Mrs. Darby replied, her voice steady but tight. "But it's nothing I can't handle. The past is the past, after all." "Of course," Miss Marple agreed. "But sometimes the past comes back to haunt us, doesn't it? Especially when there are unresolved matters left hanging in the air." Mrs. Darby stiffened, her lips pressing together. "I don't know what you're implying, Miss Marple, but I have nothing more to say about that. Lillian and we've both moved on. We were never close. I'm sure you've heard all the rumors, but that's all they are, rumors. Miss Marple didn't reply immediately. Instead, she picked up her teacup and sipped slowly, her eyes never leaving Mrs. Darby's face. The older woman was hiding something. Miss Marple was certain of that. But what was it? What had happened between them all those years ago? There was a brief moment of silence before Miss Marple spoke again, her tone casual, but with a pointed edge. You know, Mrs. Darby, I do recall a conversation I overheard at the garden party. One of the guests mentioned something rather curious about a will. Something about a fortune hidden away. Can't help but wonder if that might have something to do with Miss Farnsworth's return. Mrs. Darby's face paled slightly, her hand tightening around her teacup. I don't know what you mean, she said, her voice tinged with a thin layer of panic. There's nothing of the sort. Lillian is here for no other reason than to rekindle some old friendships, I suppose. Miss Marple's eyes flicked toward the window, where the soft glow of dusk was creeping in, casting shadows across the room. She knew that Mrs. Darby was lying, but she couldn't press too hard, not yet. Instead, she turned the conversation in a different direction, choosing her words carefully. Perhaps you're right, Mrs. Darby. Perhaps there's nothing more to it than that. But I do wonder if there was something unresolved between you and Miss Farnsworth. What would it be? The room seemed to shrink around them as the silence stretched between them. Miss Marple's words hung in the air, and she watched as Mrs. Darby shifted in her seat, her gaze now fixed on the fire. The tension in the room was thick enough to cut with a knife. I've told you everything, Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby said finally, her voice low and hesitant. There's nothing more to discuss. I suggest you leave it at that. Miss Marple stood slowly, her movements deliberate. She had learned enough. The conversation had provided her with just enough information to confirm her suspicions. Mrs. Darby was hiding something important. But Miss Marple knew that the woman wasn't ready to reveal it just yet. Of course, Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said, her voice warm, though her eyes were sharp. I shall leave it for now. But I do wonder, how long can we hide from the past before it catches up with us? Mrs. Darby said nothing, but the flicker of unease in her eyes told Miss Marple everything she needed to know. As Miss Marple left the Darby estate and made her way back to the quiet lanes of St. Mary Mead, she couldn't shake the feeling that the village was on the cusp of something bigger. The secrets of the past were starting to surface, and the truth was closer than anyone realized. The real story was beginning to unfold, and Miss Marple would be there, as always, to see it through to the end. But one thing was certain: Miss Farnsworth's return was only the beginning, and soon the village would be forced to confront everything that had been buried for so long. The days after Miss Marple's conversation with Mrs. Darby passed with a sense of quiet tension hanging over St. Mary Mead. The village, which had once thrived on its small-town gossip and gentle rhythms, now seemed to be on edge. Miss Farnsworth's return continued to unsettle everyone, but no one more so than Mrs. Darby. Miss Marple knew that Mrs. Darby was hiding something, but she had left the manor without pressing her further. Now, it seemed, the truth was not ready to emerge. The constable, too, was feeling the weight of the investigation pressing down on him. He had done his best to follow the evidence, but Miss Marple could tell that he was beginning to feel the strain. It was clear that he was trying to close the case, to wrap things up quickly, but the puzzle pieces just weren't fitting together as neatly as he hoped. Miss Marple, on the other hand, was content to let things unfold slowly, as they always did in St. Mary Mead. In her experience, the truth always made its way to the surface, sometimes after years of being buried. It was on one of these quiet days, as the cool winds of early autumn blew through the village, that Miss Marple found herself walking near the church. The sight of the old building always made her pause, as it had been a fixture in the village for so long. The church had witnessed so many things: joy, sorrow, celebrations, and tragedies, but it was the shadows it cast that intrigued Miss Marple. Shadows that, perhaps, held the key to understanding what had really been happening in St. Mary Mead. As she walked along the path that wound through the graveyard, her eyes were drawn to a familiar face. It was Miss Cutts, walking slowly through the rows of headstones. Her head was lowered, and she seemed lost in thought. Miss Marple knew that Miss Cutts, like so many others in the village, had a complicated history. The woman was known for being prim and proper, always keeping to herself. But there were whispers about her connections to some of the village's darker stories. Miss Marple had always been careful to observe Miss Cutts without drawing attention to herself, but today something felt different. Miss Cutts's behavior was subtle but telling. She wasn't just walking through the graveyard, she was heading in a specific direction. Miss Marple followed at a discreet distance, allowing Miss Cutts to lead her without seeming like she was being pursued. The older woman stopped at a particular headstone, one that was weathered with age, its inscription nearly impossible to read. She stood there for a long moment, her fingers brushing the surface of the stone, her expression distant as if lost in some private thought. Miss Marple took a breath, and, as if caught by the pull of something unseen, she slowly approached Miss Cutts. She did not speak immediately, choosing instead to let the silence stretch between them, giving Miss Cutts the time and space to break it. After a moment, Miss Cutts turned slightly, her eyes meeting Miss Marple's with a guarded expression. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice quieter than usual. "I didn't see you there." "I didn't mean to intrude," Miss Marple replied, her voice soft. "But I couldn't help noticing that you seemed rather absorbed by the headstone." Miss Cutts stiffened slightly, but her gaze softened as she glanced back at the weathered grave. "This is my husband's grave," she said, almost absently. "He passed many years ago. A tragic accident. A fall from a ladder." Miss Marple tilted her head. There was something in Miss Cutts's tone that did not quite ring true. She had heard of the accident, but she also knew that many accidents in the village were, at best, shrouded in mystery. Some were dismissed, others exaggerated. There was something about the way Miss Cutts spoke that made Miss Marple's instincts stir. "You've visited often, I take it," Miss Marple said gently, keeping her voice neutral. Miss Cutts nodded, though her posture was still stiff, betraying her discomfort. "Yes, it's been many years, but I never quite let go. He was a good man, you know, Miss Marple. He worked hard, he was kind, but sometimes I wonder if things could have been different." The vulnerability in Miss Cutts's voice was surprising. Miss Marple, ever the observant listener, took a small step closer, careful not to make Miss Cutts feel cornered. There was a depth to the woman's grief that went beyond just losing her husband. It was a grief that had taken root in her heart, and, perhaps, in her past. "What do you mean by different?" Miss Marple asked softly. "Is there something about your husband's death that troubles you?" Miss Cutts's lips trembled slightly, and for a brief moment, Miss Marple saw something flicker in her eyes, an emotion that she quickly hid, as though she were trying to push it away. "I don't know," Miss Cutts replied, her voice strained. "I just... There are things about the past that I've buried. Things that are better left alone. It's just hard, sometimes." Miss Marple studied her carefully, sensing that Miss Cutts was teetering on the edge of revealing something she wasn't ready to face. She wasn't going to push further, not yet, but she knew that Miss Cutts's silence was laden with meaning. They stood in the graveyard, the shadows growing longer with the setting sun. Miss Marple felt the weight of the conversation settle in her mind. There was something in Miss Cutts's past that she was avoiding, something that tied her to the events in St. Mary Mead, something that might have more to do with Margaret's death than she was letting on. "I'll leave you to your thoughts, Miss Cutts," Miss Marple said gently, turning to leave. "But remember, Sometimes the things we bury the deepest are the ones that demand to be remembered. Miss Cutts didn't respond immediately, but Miss Marple could sense the hesitation in her posture. As Miss Marple walked away, she could feel the question hanging in the air. What was Miss Cutts hiding? And why was she so afraid of the past? The next morning, Miss Marple decided it was time to pay another visit to the constable. The investigation had stalled, and while many villagers were eager to move on, Miss Marple knew that the case was far from closed. There were too many unanswered questions, too many connections that had yet to be made. But the village was restless, and it seemed that many people were ready to put the past behind them. When Miss Marple arrived at the constable's office, she found him sitting behind his desk, staring at a pile of papers. His brow furrowed as he looked up at her, a look of exhaustion in his eyes. "Miss Marple," he said, rubbing his eyes. "I was just going over the case again, not sure where to turn next. Everyone's been so tight-lipped. Villagers aren't talking. I can't shake the feeling that we're missing something important." Miss Marple studied him for a moment, sensing the same frustration that had been building in her own mind. "I believe you're right, Constable," she said quietly. "We're missing a piece, and I think I know where to find it." A looked up at her, his eyes narrowing slightly. Where? "I believe it lies in the past, something long buried, but still very much alive in the minds of the villagers." Miss Marple replied, "It's time we focus on the connections we've overlooked." The constable's eyes flickered with a hint of realization. "You mean Miss Cutts?" Miss Marple nodded. "Exactly. I think it's time we uncover what she's been hiding." The investigation was about to take a new turn, and Miss Marple was ready to follow the threads of the past to wherever they might lead. Tools ChatGPT said. Chapter 04. The following day, Miss Marple made her way to Miss Cutts's cottage, her mind churning with the possibility that the woman was at the center of something much darker than anyone had realized. The constable had been. Right there was something buried deep in the village's past that was starting to resurface, and Miss Cutts, with her brittle composure and odd sense of detachment, was the key to unlocking it. As she walked through the winding lanes of St. Mary Mead, Miss Marple reflected on her previous conversation with Miss Cutts. The woman had shown a vulnerability that Miss Marple hadn't expected. There was grief, certainly, but it wasn't just about the loss of a husband. It was something deeper, something tied to the history of the village itself. Miss Marple's instinct told her that Miss Cutts's past was entangled with the events that had led to Margaret's death, perhaps to Miss Farnsworth's return. Miss Cutts's house, though small and quaint, had a sense of coldness about it. The garden was meticulously cared for, but the windows were curtained tightly, as though the house was locked away from the world. When Miss Marple arrived at the door, she found it slightly ajar, a faint invitation, or perhaps a sign that Miss Cutts was waiting for her. She knocked gently, her knuckles barely making a sound against the weathered wood. The door opened slowly, and Miss Cutts appeared. Her face creased with the familiar tension that had become so evident since Miss Farnsworth's arrival. But there was something else in her eyes, a flicker of surprise, as if Miss Cutts hadn't expected her to come today. "Miss Marple," she said, her voice cautious but not unwelcoming. "I didn't think you'd be by so soon. Please, come in." Miss Marple stepped inside, noting the somber yet well-maintained interior. The house was neat, but there was a distinct lack of warmth, an absence of life that Miss Marple had grown accustomed to in so many homes. Miss Cutts had a way of arranging her life so that nothing felt too personal, nothing that could reveal too much. "I thought I'd stop by for a chat, if you don't mind," Miss Marple said, her tone light, as though she were a mere guest in someone's home. "I've been thinking more about our conversation in the graveyard." Miss Cutts stiffened slightly, but gestured for Miss Marple to sit. "I don't know what more there is to say," she said quietly. "I've already told you that my husband's death was an accident. There's nothing more to it than that." Miss Marple studied her for a moment, noting the way her hands trembled ever so slightly as she folded them on her lap. "I'm sure it was an accident," Miss Marple replied softly. "But I can't help wondering, Miss Cutts, if there's more you're not telling me about your husband's death. I mean, you seem so haunted by it." The words hung in the air between them, and Miss Cutts's face tightened, her lips pressing together as though she were trying to hold something back. There it was, again, the flicker of emotion that Miss Marple had caught before, the hint of a truth that was desperately trying to surface. Miss Cutts cleared her throat, her eyes shifting to the window as though seeking escape in the view of the garden outside. "I don't think you understand, Miss Marple," she said, her voice low and strained. "I did what I had to do, had no choice. If I hadn't, well, it would have been much worse." "Much worse for whom?" Miss Marple asked, leaning forward slightly, her voice gentle but insistent. "For your husband, or for someone else?" Miss Cutts's eyes widened for a moment, a brief flash of panic passing over her face before she quickly masked it. "What are you suggesting?" she asked, her tone sharp. "I'm not suggesting anything," Miss Marple said, her voice soft, her gaze steady. "But sometimes the past has a way of catching up with us, doesn't it? You said you didn't want to talk about it, but it seems that it's something that's been weighing on you for a long time." Miss Cutts's jaw clenched, and for a moment she was silent, her eyes darting to the door as if weighing her options. She looked at Miss Marple, her face a mask of conflict. It was clear to Miss Marple that the woman was holding on to something God, piece of the puzzle that, if revealed, might unravel everything. After a long silence, Miss Cutts spoke again, her voice trembling. "It wasn't just my husband. It was the village everything. I tried to bury it, tried to forget. But now, with Miss Farnsworth back, it's like everything is coming to the surface again." "Miss Farnsworth?" Miss Marple asked, her voice light, though her mind was racing. "How is she involved?" Miss Cutts's face paled, and she let out a shaky breath. "It's all tied together. I never meant for it to happen. When Lillian came back, I knew I'd have to face it all over again." "Face what?" "Miss Cutts." Miss Marple pressed gently, her voice barely above a whisper. "What are you trying to protect? What happened that you're still so afraid of?" Miss Cutts's eyes flickered, and for a moment, Miss Marple thought the woman might break down completely. But instead, she straightened, her expression hardening. "I can't tell you," she said firmly. "I've already said too much. All these years, I've kept it to myself. If I say anything more, it will ruin everything. You don't understand. You don't know what's at stake." Miss Marple studied her carefully, her heart heavy with understanding. There was more to Miss Cutts than met the eye, and the fear she was hiding ran deeper than mere guilt over her husband's death. This wasn't just about the past. It was about a secret that, if exposed, would destroy everything Miss Cutts had worked for. "You're right, Miss Cutts," Miss Marple said softly, her voice full of empathy. "I don't know everything, but I do know that sometimes when people carry secrets for so long, they forget that the truth always finds its way to the surface. And when it does, it can be even more painful to carry than the secret itself." Miss Cutts's eyes filled with tears, but she quickly blinked them away. She stood up abruptly, her hands clenched at her sides. "I can't do this," she said, her voice shaking. "I won't. Understand," Miss Marple said quietly, standing as well. "But you must know that the truth will come out. It always does. And when it does, you'll no longer have to carry it alone." Miss Cutts gave a sharp, almost bitter laugh. "Perhaps, but not today, Miss Marple. Not today." As Miss Marple left the cottage, she could feel the weight of Miss Cutts's unspoken words hanging in the air behind her. The woman was hiding something important, something that tied her directly to the dark past of St. Mary Mead, and Miss Farnsworth's return was no coincidence. Whatever had happened all those years ago, it had set off a chain of events that would soon come to a head. Miss Marple knew that the truth was close, so close she could almost taste it. And now she had only one question left. What was Miss Cutts so terrified of revealing? Teal's ChatGPT said. The days following her conversation with Miss Cutts were filled with a strange kind of anticipation for Miss Marple. The more she pondered what had been revealed, the more she understood how tightly wound the threads of this case were. Miss Cutts' fear, her hesitancy to speak further, had been telling. But Miss Marple knew that the truth was not something one could simply coax out with kind words. She had to find a way to break through that final wall, the one Miss Cutts had constructed to keep the past hidden. The quiet routine of St. Mary Mead seemed to continue, but Miss Marple felt as though she were on the precipice of something much larger. Miss Farnsworth's return was more than just a curious footnote in the village's history. It was a catalyst. The old secrets, once buried, were now fighting to come to the surface. And Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, was beginning to see how the villagers' pasts were intertwined with the present tragedy. She spent her days observing, as usual, visiting the baker, having tea with the shopkeeper, and even stopping by the church to chat with the vicar. In each of these brief conversations, she gleaned small but important pieces of information. It was as though the village itself was holding its breath, unsure of what to expect next. But Miss Marple knew that sooner or later, the cracks would widen, and the truth would spill out. One evening, as Miss Marple walked through the village square, she passed a group of villagers gathered by the fountain. They were deep in conversation, their voices lowered as if discussing something too sensitive for public ears. Miss Marple paused, knowing that this was her opportunity to hear what had been on everyone's mind. As she drew closer, she recognized one of the voices, Mrs. Darby's, a little higher pitched than usual, carrying an edge of anxiety. You know, Mrs. Darby was saying, people are starting to talk. Some are saying that Miss Farnsworth's return isn't just about revisiting old memories. She's come back for something more, and the longer she stays, the more uncomfortable I feel. I've heard the same, said another voice, which Miss Marple identified as Mrs. Crawford, the local seamstress. I don't trust her, not one bit. All those years, and now she's back. There must be a reason, and it isn't just nostalgia. Do you think she's here to cause trouble? Asked a third voice, a man's this time, and Miss Marple turned to see Mr. Little, the solicitor, standing among the group. His face was set in its usual neutral expression, but his eyes, Miss Marple noted, were sharp with concern. No one's saying that outright, Mrs. Darby responded, but there are plenty of people who feel uncomfortable. It's not like her to just show up, uninvited, with no explanation. I agree, Mrs. Crawford added, and I'd be lying if I didn't say that her history with you, Mrs. Darby, still leaves a bad taste in my mouth. You know what they say, people like that, they don't change. Miss Marple stood still, pretending to admire the fountain's delicate sprays. She listened to the exchange. Mrs. Darby's discomfort was palpable, and there was no mistaking the underlying tension in her voice. She was trying to dismiss the issue, but Miss Marple could sense that the words Mrs. Crawford had spoken held weight. The truth about Miss Farnsworth's return was a delicate subject, one that touched on something far deeper than anyone was willing to admit. It was then that she caught something, a small detail that she hadn't noticed before. Mr. Little, the solicitor, had shifted his position ever so slightly, glancing over his shoulder as though making sure no one else was listening. His subtle movement was not lost on Miss Marple. She had always found him to be a man of quiet but considerable influence in the village, and his behavior now suggested something more than just a passing concern. The conversation was winding down, and Miss Marple took the opportunity to slip away before anyone noticed her presence. Her mind was already working, piecing together the snippets of information she had overheard. Miss Farnsworth was more than just a woman with a contentious past. She was a disruptor, someone who had returned to challenge the delicate balance of the village. But why now? The following day, Miss Marple decided to speak with Miss Farnsworth herself. If anyone knew the true story, it would be her. The woman was an enigma, an outsider with deep ties to the village's history. Miss Marple had a feeling that the key to understanding her return lay in a conversation with the woman, who had remained strangely silent about her intentions since her arrival. She made her way to Miss Farnsworth's rented cottage at the edge of the village. The house, though modest, stood in stark contrast to the grandeur of Mrs. Darby's estate. It was small, somewhat weathered, yet charming in its own right. Miss Farnsworth was sitting outside, a book in her hands, but she looked up as Miss Marple approached. Miss Marple, she said with a thin smile. I wondered when you'd come to visit. It seems my return hasn't gone unnoticed. Miss Marple returned the smile, her voice gentle. I must admit, your return has been quite the topic of conversation. You certainly know how to make an entrance, Miss Farnsworth. The woman's smile faltered slightly, and she set the book aside, her posture rigid. I wasn't trying to cause any trouble, Miss Marple. Simply wanted to return to the place where I grew up. It's been years, you know, and yet you've only come back now, Miss Marple asked softly, her eyes never leaving Miss Farnsworth's face. I find it curious that someone who left so many years ago would choose to return now. The timing, it seems, is convenient. Miss Farnsworth's eyes narrowed slightly, though she didn't respond immediately. Instead, she folded her hands in her lap, watching Miss Marple carefully. What are you really asking, Miss Marple? Miss Marple smiled faintly, aware that she had been too direct. I'm merely curious, Miss Farnsworth, about your return, about what it is you hope to find. St. Mary Mead is a small village, and we tend to know a lot about one another. It's hard to hide things here. Is that so? Miss Farnsworth's voice was cool now, but Miss Marple detected a faint hint of nervousness in her tone. I assure you, I'm not hiding anything. I simply wanted to see the place once more. It holds memories for me, that's all. But memories can be tricky things, Miss Marple said gently. They have a way of resurfacing at the most unexpected times, and sometimes they bring with them more than just nostalgia. For a brief moment, Miss Farnsworth's face betrayed. Her fleeting expression of something akin to guilt or fear crossed her features before she quickly masked it. It was subtle, but Miss Marple noticed she had struck a nerve. Is that what you think? Miss Farnsworth asked, her voice hardening. That I've come back to stir up trouble? To expose the past? I think you've come back because you have unfinished business, Miss Farnsworth, Miss Marple replied, her tone still soft but firm. There are things you've hidden, and they're starting to resurface. I believe you've come back to settle old scores. Miss Farnsworth stood up abruptly, her movements quick and stiff. You don't know anything about me, Miss Marple, she snapped. I didn't come here to cause a scene. I just wanted peace. But peace is often the hardest thing to find when the past refuses to stay buried, Miss Marple said calmly. The truth has a way of finding its way out, no matter how deep it's been buried. Miss Farnsworth's expression shifted, her features hardening. Then, perhaps it's better if you stay out of it, Miss Marple. Some things are better left undisturbed. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. Don't agree, Miss Farnsworth. I believe the truth will eventually come out, whether you want it to or not. The silence that followed was thick with tension. Miss Farnsworth's eyes flickered, but she said nothing more. She turned away, as though dismissing the conversation. As Miss Marple left the cottage, she felt certain that Miss Farnsworth knew more than she was willing to admit. Her sudden defensiveness, the subtle cracks in her composure, it all pointed to someone who had come back for a very specific reason. The question now was what that reason was, and how deep the secrets ran. Miss Marple knew that the time was fast approaching when the entire truth would be revealed. But for now, it seemed that Miss Farnsworth was still holding back, and Miss Marple would be patient. The pieces were nearly in place. All it would take was one more revelation, one more crack in the facade, and the whole story would finally come to light. ChatGPT said, Chapter 5. The days following her confrontation with Miss Farnsworth unfolded slowly, yet the weight of their conversation lingered in Miss Marple's mind. There was something deeply unsettling about the way Miss Farnsworth had reacted to the mere suggestion that her return was anything but innocent. Her defensiveness had been quick, too quick more, like an instinctive move to protect something or someone rather than an honest desire for peace. Miss Marple had learned long ago that when people were so eager to hide the truth, it was usually because they feared what would happen if it were exposed. Still, as she walked back to her cottage that afternoon, Miss Marple's mind raced. She had uncovered many clues, but the story was still incomplete. The puzzle had a missing piece, and despite the conversations she'd had with various villagers, she couldn't quite place it. Why had Miss Farnsworth returned? And why now, after all these years? Oh, and what, if anything, was her relationship to Mrs. Darby something deeper than just an old acquaintance? In the days that followed, Miss Marple continued her quiet observations. The village remained on edge, despite the outward appearance of normalcy. People seemed to be keeping to themselves more than usual, as though they were waiting for something. Miss Farnsworth, on the other hand, was a constant presence in the village, moving around, keeping to herself, but always with a careful watch on those around her. It was during one of these quiet moments, as Miss Marple sat by her window, watching the village square below, that a new thought occurred to her, one that had been hiding in the back of her mind, but had never fully come to light. The more she thought about it, the more it made sense. There was a connection between Miss Farnsworth and the Darbys, of course, but it wasn't just about money or old grudges. The Darbys specifically. Mrs. Darby had been avoiding the truth for so long, and Miss Farnsworth had returned at the perfect time to bring it all to the surface. But what if the real reason for Miss Farnsworth's return was not just personal? What if there was something more? Miss Marple stood up suddenly, her thoughts crystallizing. She knew what she had to do. She had to visit Mrs. Darby again, and this time she would approach the conversation differently. She would need to be more direct, to unravel the layers of deceit the woman had wrapped herself in for so many years. She made her way to Mrs. Darby's estate the following morning, the air crisp and cool as autumn settled over St. Mary Mead. The manor was as imposing as ever, and Miss Marple was once again reminded of how carefully Mrs. Darby had curated her public persona. The house, the garden, even the air about the place exuded a kind of calculated perfection. Yet, beneath it all, Miss Marple knew there was something more. Mrs. Darby was not as composed as she appeared. There was something buried deep within her past, a secret, so well guarded that it had remained hidden even from the most observant eyes in the village. When Miss Marple arrived, Mrs. Darby greeted her at the door with a carefully rehearsed smile. There was nothing particularly warm about her welcome, but Miss Marple had long since stopped expecting such things. She had no desire for Mrs. Darby to like her. She only wanted the truth. Miss Marple, how good to see you again, Mrs. Darby said, her voice slightly strained. Won't you come in? It's a bit chilly out today. Miss Marple nodded and stepped inside, her eyes immediately catching the sight of the lavish decor that filled the room. Mrs. Darby's taste had always been impeccable, and everything in the drawing room seemed arranged with military precision. Not a single item was out of place. Thank you for seeing me, Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said as she sat down in the chair offered. I hope I'm not interrupting anything important. Mrs. Darby shook her head, settling into the chair across from Miss Marple. Not at all. It's always a pleasure to have you here. What brings you by today? Been thinking, Miss Marple began, carefully choosing her words, about Miss Farnsworth and your history with her. At the mention of Miss Farnsworth's name, Mrs. Darby's eyes flickered, but she quickly masked the emotion with a neutral expression. Miss Marple caught the subtle shift, and though Mrs. Darby's mask was perfect, Miss Marple knew she had struck a nerve. Lillian, Mrs. Darby said, her voice cool now. Yes, I suppose I should have expected you to ask about her. It's rather unavoidable, isn't it? She has a way of stirring up trouble, even when she means no harm. She certainly seems to have made quite an impression in such a short time, Miss Marple replied. But I wonder, Mrs. Darby, if her return is as harmless as you suggest. Could it be that Miss Farnsworth has come back to settle something more than just old memories? Mrs. Darby's gaze faltered for a moment, but she quickly recovered, straightening her posture. I don't know what you mean, Miss Marple. She's just an old acquaintance, nothing more. I wonder, Miss Marple mused aloud, her tone light but pointed. If the past were to resurface, would you be prepared to face it, to confront what's been buried all these years? Mrs. Darby's expression hardened. I've moved on, Miss Marple. I suggest you do the same. There's nothing left to revisit. But Miss Marple wasn't convinced. She had seen too many cracks in Mrs. Darby's facade, and she knew better than to believe that someone could completely bury their past. I wonder, Mrs. Darby, she said softly, leaning forward slightly, if you're sure about that, 'cause I do believe that Miss Farnsworth didn't just return to cause a stir. She's here to settle something, okay? And I think you know exactly what that something is. The silence that followed hung heavy between them. Mrs. Darby's eyes shifted uneasily, her fingers tightly gripping the armrest of her chair. Miss Marple could see the strain in her face, the way she was trying to maintain control over the conversation. But Miss Marple could also see the subtle signs of someone who was beginning to crack under pressure. I don't know what you're implying, Mrs. Darby said, her voice tight. But you're wrong. There's nothing left. The past is gone. Miss Marple's gaze remained steady, her voice calm but insistent. You're right, Mrs. Darby. The past is gone. But sometimes the past has a way of resurfacing when we least expect it. And when it does, it brings with it consequences. The tension in the room thickened, and for a brief moment, Mrs. Darby's composure faltered completely. Her lips trembled, as if she were about to say something, but then, with a sharp intake of breath, she quickly regained her control. I think you should leave, Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby said, her voice no longer pleasant, but hedged with an authority that brooked no further discussion. I don't have anything more to say. Miss Marple stood slowly, her eyes still fixed on Mrs. Darby. She could see the exhaustion, the fear, the guilt. All of it was written across the woman's face, even though she tried so hard to hide it. Of course, Mrs. Darby, Miss Marple said, her voice gentle but full of understanding. I'll leave you to your thoughts, okay? But remember, the past doesn't always stay buried. Sometimes it demands to be remembered, okay? And when it does, it's best to be ready. As Miss Marple left the manor and walked back down the long path to the village, her mind was spinning with the revelations she had just uncovered. Mrs. Darby was hiding something that connected her to Miss Farnsworth's return, and that something was at the heart of the mystery Miss Marple had been trying to solve. She had a feeling that the answers were much closer than anyone realized. The pieces were falling into place, and Miss Marple knew that soon the truth would finally come to light. The following days after her conversation with Mrs. Darby were fraught with a growing sense of urgency from Miss Marple. She could feel the puzzle coming together, the edges starting to align, but there was one key piece that remained elusive. The tension in the village had become unbearable, and every interaction seemed to carry the weight of unspoken truths. Miss Farnsworth's return, Mrs. Darby's unease, Miss Cutts's hidden fears, they were all part of something far bigger than a mere reunion of old acquaintances. The village had settled into a temporary silence, as though holding its breath, waiting for something to break the tension. But Miss Marple knew better than to trust the surface calm. Beneath it, everything was shifting. Miss Farnsworth had not spoken much since the garden party. She continued to move around the village, keeping to herself, but Miss Marple noticed that she often lingered near Mrs. Darby's estate. She was watching, waiting perhaps for the right moment to act, or perhaps for something to push her over the edge. Whatever it was, Miss Farnsworth's calm demeanor seemed increasingly like a facade. There was more at play here, and Miss Marple was determined to uncover it. One afternoon, as the sunlight faded into a soft twilight, Miss Marple decided it was time to confront Miss Farnsworth once again. She had learned enough from the villagers' whispers and Mrs. Darby's evasion to know that Miss Farnsworth was connected to something much darker than she had let on. The tension in the village, the strange behavior of the key players, everything pointed to a long-buried secret that had now resurfaced. Miss Marple made her way to Miss Farnsworth's cottage, her footsteps deliberate and steady. She had approached this mystery with patience, but now she felt the need to press. She had the pieces in place, but it was the confrontation with Miss Farnsworth that would bring the truth into focus. As she approached the small cottage, Miss Farnsworth was standing outside, her arms crossed as she stared out across the village. The expression on her face was unreadable, her eyes distant, as though lost in thought. For a moment, Miss Marple wondered if she had chosen the right time to visit. But then, as always, her instincts guided her, and she knew it was time to face the truth head-on. Miss Farnsworth. Miss Marple called softly as she neared. The woman turned slowly, her face flickering with recognition before settling into an expression of polite indifference. "Miss Marple," she said, her tone cool but not unkind. "I thought I might see you again. I'm afraid the village is full of questions." Miss Marple offered a small, understanding smile. "Indeed, Miss Farnsworth, and I believe we've yet to have a proper conversation about your return. It's been on my mind lately, and I do wonder, what is it that you're really after?" Miss Farnsworth's gaze hardened, just for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I've already told you, Miss Marple, I've come to visit. Old friends, to reminisce. Nothing more." "But surely you understand," Miss Marple continued, her voice gentle but insistent, "that your return has stirred up more than just a few old memories. It's not just about visiting. You've come back to settle something, haven't you? Something that's been left unresolved for far too long." Miss Farnsworth's jaw tightened, but she said nothing. She glanced down at her hands for a moment before meeting Miss Marple's eyes. "You have a knack for reading people, don't you?" she said with a thin smile. "I'll admit, there's more to my return than I've let on. But you're wrong if you think I've come to cause trouble." "I don't think you've come to cause trouble," Miss Marple replied thoughtfully, "but trouble has a way of finding us, doesn't it? And sometimes, when the past resurfaces, it brings with it consequences." Miss Farnsworth's eyes flashed with something, a hint of frustration, or perhaps guilt, but it was gone in the blink of an eye. "I don't see how this concerns you, Miss Marple," she said, her tone suddenly colder. "The past is the past, and it's not my fault if others can't move on. But it is your fault, isn't it?" Miss Marple pressed. "Psst, your actions have already set things in motion. You can't undo what's been done, and yet here you are, standing in the midst of it all." Miss Farnsworth stepped back, her posture stiff, her eyes narrowing. "You don't know what you're talking about," she said, her voice low but sharp. "You don't understand the history, the complications. There's more to this than you could ever imagine." Miss Marple took a small step forward, her voice softening. Then tell me, Miss Farnsworth, what is it that you're hiding? Huh? What is it that brings you back here after all these years? For a long moment, Miss Farnsworth stood in silence, her gaze fixed on the ground as though contemplating her next words. Then, at last, she spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. I didn't come back for the reasons you think, she said slowly. I came because I have to finish something that was never resolved. Something that's been buried for far too long. Miss Marple's heart quickened as the words sank in. This was the moment she had been waiting for. The truth was finally starting to take shape, but there was still so much left unsaid. What was it? Miss Marple asked, her voice barely audible. Miss Farnsworth looked up, her eyes dark with emotion. It's about the money, Miss Marple. About what was left after my father's death. About the willow. About the things that were hidden from me. Miss Marple's mind whirred with the sudden revelation. The will. The fortune. It was all coming together. But there was more there. Had to be more. Go on, Miss Marple urged, her voice steady despite the rush of thoughts in her mind. What was hidden, Miss Farnsworth? The woman's face twisted with a mixture of frustration and pain. I didn't know until recently. My father left a significant amount of money to Mrs. Darby's late husband, money that should have gone to me. But it was concealed, hidden, buried in documents I was never allowed to see. And when I returned to search for it, I realized, Mrs. Darby knew all along. Miss Marple felt the weight of the confession settle in her chest. The secrets of St. Mary Mead were deeper than she had ever imagined. And Miss Farnsworth's return was not just about old grievances, it was about a legacy of deception that had tied the village together in ways no one had suspected. So it's not just about the past. Miss Marple said softly, her voice now filled with understanding. It's about reclaiming what was taken from you. Miss Farnsworth nodded, her eyes now filled with a quiet intensity. Yes, and I won't stop until I find it, till I get what's mine. The words hung in the air, heavy with the knowledge that the truth had finally come to light. Miss Farnsworth had returned, not just for closure, but for justice, however twisted that might be. I think, Miss Marple said quietly, you may have already gotten more than you bargained for. The silence between them stretched, but Miss Marple felt the weight of the moment shift. Miss Farnsworth had revealed the key to the puzzle, the inheritance, the hidden fortune, the betrayal, but there was still one last piece to uncover, the truth of what had happened all those years ago, and how it had led to Margaret's death was still yet to be fully revealed. Miss Marple turned to leave, knowing that the time for half-truths had passed. It was time for the final revelation, and Miss Marple, as always, would be ready to expose it. Chapter 06. The days following her conversation with Miss Farnsworth were marked by a strange quietude. St. Mary Mead, once a village full of chatter and idle gossip, now seemed to hold its breath. The pieces of the puzzle were finally in place, but the final piece, the truth, still eluded Miss Marple. She could feel it in the air, a certain weight that hung over the village, waiting for the moment when it would all come to light. Miss Marple had spent the past few days revisiting old conversations, re-examining the subtle clues, and thinking over every small detail that had emerged since Miss Farnsworth's return. There were moments in the quiet of her cottage where she wondered whether she had missed something, some small hint that would suddenly bring everything into focus. But each time she doubted herself, her mind would settle on a new detail, a new revelation, and the pieces would fall back into place. She had been right all along. There was a connection between Miss Farnsworth and the Darbys, one that ran deeper than just a shared past. Mrs. Darby had known about the hidden money, the will that had been concealed, and she had been a part of the scheme to keep it all a secret. But Miss Farnsworth's return was not just about reclaiming what was rightfully hers. was about something more. It was about justice. But justice for whom? Miss Farnsworth, or for the legacy of those who had been wronged in the past. Miss Marple spent her time carefully watching the movements of the people involved. The constable had been keeping busy with the official investigation, but Miss Marple could see that he was still not entirely convinced. The pieces hadn't yet fit together for him. He was looking for a straightforward answer, a clear explanation, but Miss Marple knew better. In matters of human nature, things were rarely so simple. One evening, after a long day of observing the village, Miss Marple sat at her small writing desk, her pen in hand, when she heard a soft knock at her door. It was late, and she wasn't expecting anyone. She rose slowly, her eyes narrowing slightly in curiosity, before opening the door to find the constable standing on her doorstep, looking a little disheveled, but determined. "Good evening, Miss Marple," the constable said, his voice hesitant, but polite. "I hope I'm not disturbing you." "Not at all," Miss Marple replied, stepping aside to let him in. "What brings you here, constable? You look like you've been working late." He sighed as he entered, his face drawn with exhaustion. "I have, and it's been a frustrating day. I've been going over the evidence again, and something's been bothering me. I thought I was closer to solving this, but now I'm not so sure. There's a connection between Miss Farnsworth and Mrs. Darby. I just can't figure out what it is." Miss Marple motioned for him to sit, her sharp eyes studying his face. "Tell me what you found. I've spoken to a few more villagers," the constable began, "but every time I ask about Miss Farnsworth's history with the Darbys, I get the same reaction. Everyone's evasive. Mrs. Darby doesn't want to talk about it, and neither does Miss Farnsworth. The more I dig, the more I find that people are hiding something, but I can't put my finger on it. It's like there's something in the background that no one wants to bring into the light." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind turning over the constable's words. "And yet," she said gently, "you suspect that whatever it is, it's at the heart of this case." He nodded, his frustration clear. "I do, but I'm just not sure what it is. Miss Farnsworth has made it clear she's here to settle something, but she hasn't said what that is. And Mrs. Darby, she's hiding something too. It's all a tangled mess." Miss Marple studied the constable for a long moment, then leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "You're close, constable. Very close. But you're missing the connections. You see, the truth isn't about a simple will or a fortune hidden away. It's about the relationships between the people in this village, what they've done to protect their own secrets." The constable frowned, trying to follow her line of reasoning. "But I don't understand. Are you saying that Miss Farnsworth and Mrs. Darby are involved in something?" "More precisely," Miss Marple replied, "Miss Farnsworth's return isn't just about the money. It's about what was hidden, what was buried, something that affected both her and Mrs. Darby. And it's also about a death that was never fully explained." The constable looked at her, his brow furrowed. "A death?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, constable. The death of Miss Farnsworth's father. It was never truly investigated, not properly." "What if I told you that his death was no accident?" The constable's eyes widened, and he leaned forward, his attention fully on Miss Marple. "Are you suggesting that it wasn't an accident? That someone ... murdered him?" Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "I'm suggesting that Miss Farnsworth's return has everything to do with the death of her father, and I believe that Mrs. Darby knows more than she's letting on. The hidden fortune, the will, was just a small part of a much bigger picture. The truth, constable, is that the death of Miss Farnsworth's father was no accident. It was orchestrated." The constable's face paled, and he leaned back, stunned. "But why? Why would someone want him dead?" Miss Marple took a deep breath, allowing the silence to stretch between them. "Because, constable, Miss Farnsworth's father was involved in something that threatened the power structure of this village. His death was convenient for some people, and those people would do anything to ensure that the secrets remained hidden. The constable looked up, as though seeing the whole case in a new light. You mean, it wasn't just a family dispute over money, it was a cover-up? Yes, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but resolute. The money, the will, the hidden fortune, they were all distractions. The real motive, the real reason for his death, was something far more dangerous. It was about power, about keeping things in control. And when Miss Farnsworth uncovered what had been done, she came back to claim what was rightfully hers and expose the truth. The constable stood up, his face a mixture of disbelief and determination. We have to act on this. We need to confront Mrs. Darby. If what you're saying is true, she's been covering up a murder. Miss Marple shook her head. Not just any murder, Constable. A murder that ties this entire village together. But we must proceed carefully. We can't accuse anyone without the proper evidence. The constable nodded, clearly eager to act. I'll go to her. I'll confront her. No, Miss Marple said firmly. Not yet. We need more than suspicion. We need proof. And I believe Miss Farnsworth has what we need. With those words, Miss Marple stood up, her eyes steady and focused. The pieces of the puzzle were now in place. The final revelation was drawing near, and soon the truth would come to light. The villagers of St. Mary Mead would finally face the consequences of their actions, of a death long buried, and of secrets too powerful to stay hidden forever. And Miss Marple, as always, would be the one to bring it all to the surface. Till the following morning, the mist still clung to the village, and the scent of dew-filled earth lingered in the air. Miss Marple could sense that the moment for final revelations was drawing near. The weight of the investigation had grown heavy on the village, and the tension in the air was palpable. Every glance between the villagers seemed to carry more meaning than it had before. Every conversation more loaded with hidden implications. St. Mary Mead, for all its picturesque tranquility, was a place full of buried secrets, and Miss Marple knew that it was time for those secrets to be brought into the light. After her conversation with the constable the previous evening, Miss Marple had spent the night turning over the evidence once more. The puzzle pieces, seemingly insignificant, on their own had finally clicked into place. The death of Miss Farnsworth's father, the hidden fortune, the motives of those involved, and the long-simmering resentments of the villagers all came together in a web that was now almost too obvious to ignore. There was still one final confrontation left to be had, the one with Mrs. Darby. Miss Marple had carefully watched her movements over the past few days, noting her increasingly erratic behavior and the way her nerves seemed to fray under the weight of the questions that had been left unanswered for so long. Miss Marple was certain that Mrs. Darby had known about Miss Farnsworth's father's death, and that she had played a direct role in concealing the truth. It was time for Miss Marple to visit Mrs. Darby once more. But this time, the approach would be different. Miss Marple had long understood the value of patience, but today she would not wait for Mrs. Darby to reveal her secrets. Today, Miss Marple would make Mrs. Darby face the past that had defined so much of the village's history. The walk to Mrs. Darby's manner felt familiar, yet the atmosphere surrounding Miss Marple seemed charged with a sense of anticipation, as though everything had led to this moment. The road was still quiet as she made her way through the village, the only sounds being the soft crunch of her shoes against the gravel path and the occasional rustle of the wind. Through the trees, when Miss Marple arrived at the grand front door of the Darby estate, she was greeted by the housemaid with a polite but strained smile. There was no warmth in the greeting, no sense of the comfort that usually came with a visit to the Darbys. The tension was already visible, and Miss Marple could feel it settling into her bones as she entered the house. Mrs. Darby was in her sitting room, just as Miss Marple had expected. She stood by the window, staring out at the garden, her posture tense and stiff. The quiet hum of the room contrasted sharply with the emotions Miss Marple could sense beneath the surface. Mrs. Darby, ever composed, looked up only when Miss Marple cleared her throat softly to announce her presence. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby said, her voice forced but polite. "How lovely to see you. I must admit, I wasn't expecting you today, Miss." Marple gave a small, polite smile as she made her way to a chair near the fire. "I wasn't planning to come either, Mrs. Darby, but I found myself compelled to revisit our earlier conversation." Mrs. Darby's eyes flickered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't know what more there is to say, Miss Marple. I've told you everything I can about Miss Farnsworth's return. There's nothing new to discuss, Miss." Marple studied her closely, taking in the subtle tremor in Mrs. Darby's hand as she poured tea into the cups. The woman was trying so hard to maintain her poise, but Miss Marple could see the cracks appearing. The fear, the guilt, it was all there, hidden beneath the surface. "I think there is more to say, Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said softly. "You and I both know that Miss Farnsworth's return isn't just about old friendships or memories. It's about something far more dangerous, isn't it?" Mrs. Darby stiffened at the words, but she did not reply. Her eyes briefly darted toward the window again, as though seeking some sort of escape from the conversation. Miss Marple didn't press further. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, allowing the tension to build. Finally, Mrs. Darby spoke, her voice low and trembling. "What are you implying, Miss Marple? I don't know what you think you've uncovered, but there's nothing I've done that. I've spoken to a few more villagers," the constable began. "But every time I ask about Miss Farnsworth's history with the Darbys, I get the same reaction. Everyone's evasive. Mrs. Darby doesn't want to talk about it, and neither does Miss Farnsworth. The more I dig, the more I find that people are hiding something, but I can't put my finger on it. It's like there's something in the background that no one wants to bring into the light." Miss Marple nodded slowly, her mind turning over the constable's words. "And yet," she said gently, "you suspect that whatever it is, it's at the heart of this case." He nodded, his frustration clear. "I do, but I'm just not sure what it is. Miss Farnsworth has made it clear she's here to settle something, but she hasn't said what that is. And Mrs. Darby, she's hiding something too. It's all a tangled mess." Miss Marple studied the constable for a long moment, then leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "You're close, Constable. Very close. But you're missing the connections. You see, the truth isn't about a simple will or a fortune hidden away. It's about the relationships between the people in this village, what they've done to protect their own secrets." The constable frowned, trying to follow her line of reasoning. "But I don't understand. Are you saying that Miss Farnsworth and Mrs. Darby are involved in something?" "More precisely," Miss Marple replied, "Miss Farnsworth's return isn't just about the money. It's about what was hidden, what was buried, something that affected both her and Mrs. Darby. And it's also about a death that was never fully explained." The constable looked at her, his brow furrowed. "A death?" Miss Marple nodded. "Yes, Constable. It's the death of Miss Farnsworth's father. It was never truly investigated, not properly. What if I told you that? His death was no accident." The constable's eyes widened, and he leaned forward, his attention fully on Miss Marple. "Are you suggesting that it wasn't an accident? That someone ... murdered him?" Miss Marple's gaze remained steady. "I'm suggesting that Miss Farnsworth's return has everything to do with the death of her father. And I believe that Mrs. Darby knows more than she's letting on. The hidden fortune, the will, was just a small part of a much bigger picture. The truth, Constable, is that the death of Miss Farnsworth's father was no accident. It was orchestrated." The constable's face paled, and he leaned back, stunned. "But why? Why would someone want him dead?" Miss Marple took a deep breath, allowing the silence to stretch between them, because Constable, Miss Farnsworth's father, was involved in something that threatened the power structure of this village. His death was convenient for some people, and those people would do anything to ensure that the secrets remained hidden. The constable looked up, as though seeing the whole case in a new light. You mean, it wasn't just a family dispute over money, it was a cover-up? Yes, Miss Marple said, her voice soft but resolute. The money, the will, the hidden fortune, they were all distractions. The real motive, the real reason for his death, was something far more dangerous. It was about power, about keeping things in control. And when Miss Farnsworth uncovered what had been done, she came back to claim what was rightfully hers and expose the truth. The constable stood up, his face a mixture of disbelief and determination. We have to act on this. We need to confront Mrs. Darby. If what you're saying is true, she's been covering up a murder. Miss Marple shook her head. Not just any murder, Constable. A murder that ties this entire village together. But we must proceed carefully. We can't accuse anyone without the proper evidence. The constable nodded, clearly eager to act. I'll go to her. I'll confront her. No, Miss Marple said firmly. Not yet. We need more than suspicion. We need proof. And I believe Miss Farnsworth has what we need. With those words, Miss Marple stood up, her eyes steady and focused. The pieces of the puzzle were now in place. The final revelation was drawing near, and soon the truth would come to light. The villagers of St. Mary Mead would finally face the consequences of their actions, of a death long buried, and of secrets too powerful to stay hidden forever. And Miss Marple, as always, would be the one to bring it all to the surface. Till the following morning, the mist still clung to the village, and the scent of dew-filled earth lingered in the air. Miss Marple could sense that the moment for final revelations was drawing near. The weight of the investigation had grown heavy on the village, and the tension in the air was palpable. Every glance between the villagers seemed to carry more meaning than it had before. Every conversation more loaded with hidden implications. St. Mary Mead, for all its picturesque tranquility, was a place full of buried secrets, and Miss Marple knew that it was time for those secrets to be brought into the light. After her conversation with the constable the previous evening, Miss Marple had spent the night turning over the evidence once more. The puzzle pieces, seemingly insignificant, on their own had finally clicked into place. The death of Miss Farnsworth's father, the hidden fortune, the motives of those involved, and the long-simmering resentments of the villagers all came together in a web that was now almost too obvious to ignore. There was still one final confrontation left to be had, the one with Mrs. Darby. Miss Marple had carefully watched her movements over the past few days, noting her increasingly erratic behavior and the way her nerves seemed to fray under the weight of the questions that had been left unanswered for so long. Miss Marple was certain that Mrs. Darby had known about Miss Farnsworth's father's death, and that she had played a direct role in concealing the truth. It was time for Miss Marple to visit Mrs. Darby once more. But this time, the approach would be different. Miss Marple had long understood the value of patience, but today she would not wait for Mrs. Darby to reveal her secrets. Today, Miss Marple would make Mrs. Darby face the past that had defined so much of the village's history. The walk to Mrs. Darby. Darby's manner felt familiar, yet the atmosphere surrounding Miss Marple seemed charged with a sense of anticipation, as though everything had led to this moment. The road was still quiet as she made her way through the village, the only sounds being the soft crunch of her shoes against the gravel path and the occasional rustle of the wind. Through the trees, when Miss Marple arrived at the grand front door of the Darby estate, she was greeted by the housemaid with a polite but strained smile. There was no warmth in the greeting, no sense of the comfort that usually came with a visit to the Darbys. The tension was already visible, and Miss Marple could feel it settling into her bones as she entered the house. Mrs. Darby was in her sitting room, just as Miss Marple had expected. She stood by the window, staring out at the garden, her posture tense and stiff. The quiet hum of the room contrasted sharply with the emotions Miss Marple could sense beneath the surface. Mrs. Darby, ever composed, looked up only when Miss Marple cleared her throat softly to announce her presence. "Miss Marple," Mrs. Darby said, her voice forced but polite. "How lovely to see you. I must admit, I wasn't expecting you today, Miss." Marple gave a small, polite smile as she made her way to a chair near the fire. "I wasn't planning to come either, Mrs. Darby, but I found myself compelled to revisit our earlier conversation." Mrs. Darby's eyes flickered for a moment, but she quickly regained her composure. "I don't know what more there is to say, Miss Marple. I've told you everything I can about Miss Farnsworth's return. There's nothing new to discuss, Miss." Marple studied her closely, taking in the subtle tremor in Mrs. Darby's hand as she poured tea into the cups. The woman was trying so hard to maintain her poise, but Miss Marple could see the cracks appearing. The fear, the guilt, it was all there, hidden beneath the surface. "I think there is more to say, Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said softly. "You and I both know that Miss Farnsworth's return isn't just about old friendships or memories. It's about something far more dangerous, isn't it?" Mrs. Darby stiffened at the words, but she did not reply. Eyes briefly darted toward the window again, as though seeking some sort of escape from the conversation. Miss Marple didn't press further. Instead, she let the silence stretch between them, allowing the tension to build. Finally, Mrs. Darby spoke, her voice low and trembling. "What are you implying, Miss Marple? I don't know what you think you've uncovered, but there's nothing I've done that. Miss Marple paused, considering her words carefully. "Sometimes, Miss Cutts, the best thing we can do is face the truth, not just for ourselves, but for everyone we've hurt along the way." Miss Cutts remained silent for a long moment, her gaze distant. Finally, she looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes filled with a mixture of fear and resignation. "I've been hiding for so long," she whispered, "and I don't know if I can ever make it right." Miss Marple gave her a small, understanding smile. "Making things right doesn't always mean undoing the past, Miss Cutts. Sometimes it's about learning to move forward, to forgive ourselves." Miss Cutts nodded slowly, but Miss Marple could tell that the woman still had many unresolved emotions. The path to reconciliation would not be easy for her, nor for anyone else in the village who had been caught up in the web of deceit. As Miss Marple left Miss Cutts and continued her walk through the village, she felt the weight of the situation pressing in on her. The truth had been exposed, but the repercussions of it had yet to be fully felt. People would have to come to terms with their past actions, and some would find that harder than others. But Miss Marple knew that this was only the beginning. The village had changed, and St. Mary Mead would never be the same again. Yet, despite the weight of the truth and the complexity of the relationships now laid bare, Miss Marple couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet satisfaction. The truth had emerged, and with it, the possibility of healing. It was time for St. Mary Mead to move forward, even if it meant facing difficult truths and confronting painful memories. Miss Marple, ever the patient observer, would be there to guide them, as always, through the storm. And in the end, she knew the village would be stronger for it. The days following Miss Marple's conversation with Miss Cutts were filled with a growing sense of unease. The truth, once revealed, had shaken the villagers, leaving them to confront the dark history that had remained hidden for so long. As Miss Marple walked through the now quiet streets of St. Mary Mead, she could feel the subtle shift in the village. There was a palpable tension in the air, as though the very ground beneath their feet had been altered. Secrets, once buried deep, had now resurfaced, and the consequences of those secrets were only just beginning to unfold. Miss Marple had always believed that the truth, no matter how well hidden, would eventually find its way to the surface. And now, with Miss Farnsworth's return, the veil of silence that had cloaked the village for so long had been lifted. But while the truth had been uncovered, the damage it caused was only beginning to show. The Darby estate, once a symbol of wealth and power in St. Mary Mead, now stood as a somber reminder of the lies and deception that had shaped the village's history. Mrs. Darby, her once impeccable composure shattered, had retreated from the public eye. Her presence was still felt in the village, but she no longer held the same sway she once had. The villagers, once eager to align themselves with her, now spoke of her with hushed voices and cautious glances. Miss Farnsworth, too, had kept her distance since the revelation of the hidden fortune and the role the Darbys had played in her father's death. She had remained largely out of sight. But Miss Marple knew that Miss Farnsworth was not someone who would stay in the shadows for long. She had come back to confront her past, and nothing would stop her from seeking the justice she felt was owed to her. Miss Marple had visited Mrs. Darby's manor again, hoping to learn more about the depth of the woman's involvement in the deception. But Mrs. Darby had become even more reclusive, hiding herself away in her home. Miss Marple's attempts to engage her in conversation had been met with polite but firm refusals. Mrs. Darby had built a wall around herself, one that Miss Marple had learned to recognize in others. It was a defense mechanism, a way of protecting herself from the fallout of her own actions. But Miss Marple knew that walls, no matter how high, eventually crumble. It was only a matter of time before Mrs. Darby would have to face the consequences of her decisions. And when that moment came, Miss Marple would be there to see it through. In the meantime, the village continued its uneasy existence. The calm after the storm tinged with uncertainty. The villagers spoke less and less, their conversations now focused on more mundane matters. But Miss Marple could see the strain in their eyes, the weight of the past pressing down on them. There was no going back to the way things had been. It was on one such day, when the air was thick with the first hint of winter, that Miss Marple received an unexpected visitor. As she sat by the fire, a knock sounded at the door. Miss Marple rose slowly, her mind racing with the possibilities. Who could it be at this hour? She opened the door to find Miss Farnsworth standing on her doorstep, her face drawn and weary. The woman's usual composure was gone, replaced by an air of exhaustion that seemed to radiate from her. Miss Marple studied her carefully, noting the lines of stress on her face and the tension in her posture. "Miss Marple," Miss Farnsworth said, her voice strained. "I need your help." Miss Marple gestured for her to come in, her curiosity piqued. "Of course, Miss Farnsworth. Please, come inside. You look troubled." Miss Farnsworth stepped into the cottage, her eyes scanning the room as though she were searching for something. She sank into the chair Miss Marple had offered, her hands trembling slightly as she clasped them together. It was clear that she had been holding something in for a long time, something that she had not been able to express until now. "I don't know where else to turn," Miss Farnsworth said quietly, her voice faltering. "I've done everything I can to uncover the truth, to expose what happened to my father. But it's not enough. The truth, it's not enough. There are people in this village who will do anything to protect their secrets, and I don't know how much longer I can keep fighting." Miss Marple sat down across from her, her expression soft but resolute. "What do you mean, Miss Farnsworth? What more is there to uncover?" Miss Farnsworth looked up at Miss Marple, her eyes dark with frustration and pain. "I've been going over everything, the will, the letters, the papers my father left behind. I know there's more, something I haven't found yet. No matter how much I search, it's like they're all trying to keep me from the truth. The people who are protecting their secrets," Miss Marple said slowly, her voice filled with understanding. "They have a great deal to lose, don't they?" Miss Farnsworth nodded, her eyes hardening. Yes, but it's not just about the money anymore. It's about what happened to my father. It's about what they did to him. Miss Marple's mind raced. She had long suspected that Miss Farnsworth's father's death was no accident, that it had been orchestrated in some way. But now, as she listened to the pain in Miss Farnsworth's voice, she realized that the woman had uncovered something far more sinister than she had initially imagined. "What do you believe happened to him, Miss Farnsworth?" Miss Marple asked, quietly, her gaze fixed on the woman before her. "I believe," Miss Farnsworth began, her voice low but steady, "that my father was murdered, and I believe that Mrs. Darby knows who did it." Miss Marple's heart skipped a beat, and she studied Miss Farnsworth's face closely. There was no hesitation in her voice, no doubt in her eyes. She was certain. "I've been piecing the details together," Miss Farnsworth continued. "My father was about to expose something that would have ruined everything for them. But they couldn't let that happen, not when so much was at stake." Miss Marple leaned forward, her hands clasped in her lap. "What was it, Miss Farnsworth? What was your father about to expose?" Miss Farnsworth's eyes flickered with something like fear, but also resolve. "It was the money, the inheritance, the fortune that my father had been promised but never received. It wasn't just about the money itself, it was about the power that came with it. And when my father started asking too many questions, they decided he had to be stopped." Miss Marple sat back in her chair, her mind racing as she processed the new information. She had suspected that there was more to Miss Farnsworth's father's death than anyone had been willing to admit. But now she saw the depth of the conspiracy that had been woven through the village's history. It wasn't just about a fortune, it was about control, about power, and those who had held that power would stop at nothing to protect it. "Miss Farnsworth," Miss Marple said, her voice calm but filled with urgency, "you are right to seek the truth, but you must be careful. There are people in this village who will go to great lengths to protect their secrets. And the truth, as you've already seen, is not something they will easily let go of." Miss Farnsworth nodded, her face grim but determined. "I know, but I can't stop now. Not after everything that's happened. I need to know the truth, and I won't rest until I have it. Miss Marple gave a small, understanding smile. "And you will have it, Miss Farnsworth, but not by rushing into confrontation. The truth has a way of revealing itself, but we must be patient. And when it does, it will be clear for everyone." Miss Farnsworth sat silently, contemplating Miss Marple's words. The weight of the situation hung heavy in the room. Miss Marple knew that the end was drawing near, that the final confrontation was inevitable. But she also knew that it would be a confrontation with a past that had shaped the village in ways no one had fully understood. The truth was almost within reach, and soon the people of St. Mary Mead would have to face the consequences of their actions. And when that moment arrived, Miss Marple would be there to guide them, as always, to the inevitable conclusion. ChatGPT said, the air in St. Mary Mead was colder now, the early signs of winter creeping in as the trees in the village square began to shed their leaves. The village, once vibrant with the hum of daily life, now felt subdued, as though everyone was holding their breath, waiting for something inevitable to occur. Miss Marple could sense the change more acutely than anyone else. Ski had seen it. All before villages, families, people who carried their secrets until they could no longer bear the weight of them. And now it seemed the time had come for those secrets to be exposed. And the reckoning was fast approaching. Miss Farnsworth's presence in the village had stirred everything up, but it had also acted as a catalyst. The truth, long buried, had begun to unravel. And the village, once so tightly knit, was now on the verge of an explosion. The hidden past, wrapped in layers of lies and deceit, had been uncovered. It was a matter of who would act on it first and what the consequences would be for those who had spent years trying to suppress the truth. Miss Marple had spent the last few days gathering her thoughts and piecing together the last fragments of the mystery. The story was now clear. Miss Farnsworth had come back to expose the truth about her father's death, the fortune that had been hidden from her, and the betrayal that had shaped so many lives. Mrs. Darby, once the unquestioned matriarch of the village, had been at the center of the conspiracy. She had played a part in covering up the murder of Miss Farnsworth's father, a murder that had been carefully orchestrated to maintain control over the money, perhaps even the village itself. Miss Marple knew, however, that it wasn't just Mrs. Darby who needed to face the consequences of her actions. There were others in the village who had been complicit, whether out of fear, greed, or self-preservation. The truth was a force, and it would touch everyone who had been involved, even those who thought themselves beyond suspicion. The last step, Miss Marple realized, was to bring everyone together. She had observed, listened, and pieced together the puzzle. But now she needed to confront those responsible and allow the truth to fully come to light. Farnsworth, Mrs. Darby, and the others had their parts to play, and it was time for them all to face the music. She sent a letter to Mrs. Darby, a simple note requesting a meeting, and then made her way to the Darby estate. She had no illusions about the woman's willingness to come clean. But Miss Marple understood the power of confrontation. Mrs. Darby had avoided it long enough, and Miss Marple had made her decision. It was time to end the game of secrets. As Miss Marple arrived at the Darby estate, she was once again struck by its imposing grandeur. The manor, with its stone walls and manicured gardens, was a symbol of everything that had been built on lies. But now, those lies were starting to crack, and the once immaculate walls would soon be brought down. The housemaid greeted her quietly, ushering Miss Marple into the drawing room. Mrs. Darby was sitting by the fire, her hands folded neatly in her lap, her posture as rigid as ever. But there was something in her eyes, a flicker of fear that Miss Marple hadn't seen before. For all her attempts to maintain control, the woman was beginning to unravel. Miss Marple, Mrs. Darby said, her voice cold but strained. "I'm surprised to see you again. I thought we had already spoken about everything that needed to be said." Miss Marple studied her for a moment, noting the tension in the woman's features. Mrs. Darby was hiding something, of course, but Miss Marple had learned long ago that people rarely revealed themselves outright. They needed to be coaxed, to be given the space to let the truth slip out on its own. "I must admit, Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said gently, "I've been thinking a great deal about our last conversation, about what you said regarding your husband's death and how you were involved in covering it up." Mrs. Darby's face tightened, her eyes flickering nervously as she straightened in her chair. "I've already told you all I know, Miss Marple," she said quickly, her voice rising slightly. "There's nothing more to discuss." Miss Marple's voice remained calm, but it was firm. "You're wrong, Mrs. Darby. There's more. There's always more. And it's time for you to tell the truth." For a moment, Mrs. Darby seemed to hesitate, as though she were weighing her options. But Miss Marple could see the battle in her eyes, the guilt, the fear, and the knowledge that her lies were about to come crashing down. "I don't have to explain myself to you," Mrs. Darby said, her voice a little more brittle now. "I did what I had to do to protect my family, and I would do it again if I had the chance. You can't understand the pressure I was under." Miss Marple stood up slowly, her movements deliberate. She had reached the point where there was no more time for gentleness. It was time for the truth to be heard. "You're right, Mrs. Darby," Miss Marple said, her voice low but unwavering. "I don't understand the pressure you were under, but what I do understand is that no one has the right to take another person's life to protect their own. You may have hidden behind your wealth and status, but the truth is finally coming to light. It's time to face the consequences of your actions. Mrs. Darby's face drained of color, her lips trembling. I didn't mean for it to go this far, she whispered, her voice barely audible. But I was scared. We had so much to lose. Mr. Marple's eyes softened, though her expression remained resolute. And now, everything you've worked for is about to come crashing down. The truth is out, Mrs. Darby, and there's no way to hide from it anymore. The silence that followed was thick with the weight of Miss Marple's words. For a time, Mrs. Darby seemed to shrink. Her imposing presence diminished as the truth settled around her like a heavy cloak. I can't change what happened, Mrs. Darby said, her voice breaking. I can't undo it. You can't, Miss Marple agreed. But you can face it. You can stop hiding. And in that moment, as the fire crackled softly in the background, Miss Marple knew that the village of St. Mary Mead would never be the same. The truth had been revealed, and those who had been complicit in the lies and the cover-ups would have to answer for their actions. But for Miss Marple, the work was far from over. The village was on the brink of a new chapter, one that would be shaped by the consequences of the secrets that had been kept hidden for so long. And Miss Marple, as always, would be there to see it through to the end. As Miss Marple left the Darby estate, she felt a deep sense of satisfaction. The truth, at last, had come to light. And now, the people of St. Mary Mead would have to reckon with it.